Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome Margaret Elphinstone, the eminent novelist, to our Dovetails event this afternoon. Margaret has written 10 novels, among them The Sea Road, which is a very well-known novel about the Viking exploration of the North Atlantic. She's also written 2 books on organic gardening, which is a bit left field. She was Professor of Writing at Strathclyde University, and her current book is of great interest to Dovetails, obviously, because it's about a post-war world and the trauma involved for the characters in that world. It's published by Wild Goose Publications, which is the Iona community's imprint, and it's the only piece of fiction they have ever published. Normally, well, if you look in the website, there are readings for Lent, there are books for pilgrimages to Iona, and there's even a hand washing service for Monday, Thursday. So Margaret is bringing something new to the Iona community. I'm going to ask Margaret to read an extract from the book. It's called Lost People, and you can obtain it from Wild Goose Publications. And we will, you'll find that link on our website, dovetailsscotland.co.uk. So I'm going to hand over now to Margaret Elphinstone.
Right, thank you very much. I'm just going to read a bit from Lost People. The bit I'm going to read there, the book is narrated by a character who begins as a small child but grows, and at a certain point has to set out on a journey through a landscape which is clearly post-war. This is a post-war traumatized world, but there is regeneration in the natural world, and this is a bit about arriving in a ruined city. And the character Rue has a small dog as a companion. This dog is called Cosette. I could say about Cosette, Cosette is the only character I've ever put into fiction who I can honestly say is based on a real living being. People sometimes ask if human characters are based on real people, and I always say what nonsense, but this was different. Anyway, this is being narrated by Rue. Wherever we walked, we found fields untilled, pastures overgrown, and the wild remnants of herds and flocks. Cosette hated the dogs howling at night. It wasn't the animals I minded, but wherever we found traces of feral people, we went another way. Cosette and I each feared our own kind more than anything else in the world. On the other hand, we liked the way the forest was reclaiming its own, an unstoppable advance of green which hurt no one and engulfed everything, faster than a thought, one farmer told me. We found a city clothed in green. Groping roots were pulling apart houses, squares, streets, shops, and warehouses. Had it happened faster, the noise must have been tremendous. But as it was, to our quick ears, there was only a consuming silence. Everywhere, the stinging nettles were almost as tall as I was. I could see where Cosette was going because they shook as she pushed her way through. We followed bramble-choked streets, bright with daisies, campion, foxgloves, angelica, and willow herb. Young birches burst through broken roofs. We crossed jagged thresholds into crazy rooms, all leading into one another but open to the sky. Creeper-covered gaps had once been windows, through which checkered sunlight flickered on the smashed-up tiles. We daren't go under the drooping roofs, but we peered into the darkness. Once we disturbed a sow with piglets. Sparrows rose from the ivy, and rabbits scuttled out of dandelion yellow courtyards when they heard our footsteps. A roe deer bounded from a doorway, and I hissed at Cosette not to chase it. I was afraid she'd get lost in these labyrinthine alleys. In one place we found an adder curled up on a broken flagstone, and in the room beyond there was a table spread with ghostly cups and plates. One day the refectory might look like that. I called Cosette to come away, and soon after we left the city. Everywhere we stayed, once folk were gathered round the fire in the evenings, the stories began. I remember. Cosette and I usually went to our lair earlier than anyone else. I found the enigma of the magician's white rabbit more enticing than other people's unhappiness. Then came the hungry gap, and for a while that was bad. Cosette and I kept walking under wintry skies, through empty villages and graveyards, past derelict fields along vanishing paths. Cosette would sometimes disappear into the undergrowth and come back with a whitened bone. Once she beat off a bevy of kites and snatched half a rabbit. I was terrified a kite would carry her off. Cosette wasn't scared. She thought she was a wolf, and she wasn't far wrong, except about her size, of which she hadn't a notion. Being a scavenger, I fared worse, until at last, one icy morning under a cold sun, we came over a pass and looked down on the sea. The sea sparkled, too bright to bear, yet I couldn't look away. My eyes hurt, water ran down my cheeks. The sea shimmered, just like. I thought of the summer trees shimmering in the haze beyond the knot garden. I conjured up the knot garden itself, its 4 quadrangles, its enclosing paths, the angles of the box hedges, the sundial in the middle, the curve of warm steps. Gradually, the world reconfigured. I breathed again and looked it in the face. The sea was a shining emptiness, stretching to an inconceivable horizon. I sniffed, and before I even caught the tang of salt, I knew exactly what the smell would be. Inside my mind appeared a wooden shed, a wide door open to a shingle beach, a honey-coloured boat upside down on trestles, smell of salt water mingled with fresh-sawn shavings, tools back there in the gentle dark, tools handled with skill and knowledge, seemed hands. Cosette licked my hand. Come on, it's all right, we better get going. She trotted along neatly, tail curled jauntily over her back, legs going like a kestrel's wings. I fell into pace behind her, as I always did, heading downhill towards that disquieting sea. That's it.
Thank you very much. Um, I think there's so much in it which is the great strength of the book, the sort of feeling for nature. And I gather you actually worked as a gardener for some time. This kind of permeates the whole book.
Well, I did, yeah. I worked as a gardener before I sort of fell back into academia. I would say gardening is more peaceful. But yes, I worked as a gardener for several years.
And um, I suppose the question you always ask a writer is, why did you write this book? Where did this book come from?
Well, I surprised myself because I thought I wasn't going to write another novel. And it is a novella, it's quite short. But I found most of the novels I've written have been historical, and I tend to get immersed in a different world for a number of years and really sort of go somewhere else. This one I felt came out of so much happening around me, and history is happening so quickly, and I see so many things we've kind of known are going to happen for so many years. beginning to, I mean, you can see the cracks now. It's happening. And I had to address it somehow. I had to do something. And I think particularly thinking about children, thinking about what kind of world we're leaving, because I mean, I won't be there for all that much longer, I suppose, a while yet, I hope. But I think we have left a terrible inheritance, and just thinking, I have to say something about this. And it kind of grew. It grew around the idea of a, well, not just an idea, of a child who's isolated, who's traumatized, who is being let down by the world in which they find themselves. And it grew from there into thinking about a larger situation, I would say.
The central character, Rue, she's a very spiky wee girl, isn't she? She's traumatised at the beginning. She's an elective mute. She's so traumatised. And then she eventually does get to speak, but she survives because of the kindness of others. But she's not really very kind herself. And
No,
that's very
Rue is
interesting.
not particularly kind. I would say something else about Rue, which I have found very interesting, that Rue actually never discloses Rue's gender.
Yes.
You, like many, have used the she pronoun for Rue. Other people have used a he pronoun. Rue actually never says.
And
Which,
yes, and you have the
with
thing at the beginning where the nun, Sister Angela, calls her he, she, and it throughout the course of
that's
um
right.
yes,
Yes.
yes.
But what
So
you say about Rue not being kind, I think that is definitely the case. And anything helpful or positive that Rue does is often rather in spite of themselves. I mean, I don't, it doesn't come naturally.
no, except that what she is doing is creative and is being shared with other people, and she learns to tolerate other people in her garden, and actually in the and seems to quite like it. And I'm sorry, I keep saying she because I think she's a girl, but
Carrie, I don't think she or he is wrong. I just left it open, and I'm very intrigued by how people have responded. I
yeah.
just find that intriguing, and there isn't a right or wrong answer to this, I don't think. But yeah, and the creative urge is definitely there. And for Rue, it goes into the music, into the garden, into the interest in herbs and so forth, but not willingly shared. Rue does learn to share, but I would not say Rue had an instinct to rush out and help others.
I suppose that's part of what happens to society after a war. I remember reading something about the concentration camps and how when they were opened at the end of the war and food came in, people were fighting each other. Now they had all been in this together. They had been in the most extreme situation. But and you see it every time there's a food drop in Gaza, you know, I was in Rwanda when all of that was going on, and they really had to make rules so that people didn't fight for the food, for what was left.
I think one hears conflicting reactions to all these situations of, I mean, I'm happy to say I do not know what it is like to be that hungry, to be starving. I cannot say what I do. But there seem to be two things going on, that people, when something terrible happens, there are people who move towards it and want to engage and help. And there are people who are just beyond desperation to get what they need for themselves. Who can judge? I mean, I'm not in a position to. But I think, I mean, for example, I signed a petition this morning about that doctor in Gaza, the one who's been captured by the Israelis and vanished. Somebody who moves towards the situation, with immense courage. I can't imagine what that would be like either. But I
Yeah.
think you see both, and I think in the book, I hope you see both, that people will fight for their own survival. Yeah, who knows what an individual would do, but people will also move towards a situation to help. Maybe
Yes, yes, and the act of giving Rue the dog is an act of kindness, isn't it? You know, she is given this dog to look after, and
you could say
um,
Eleanor is desperate to get rid of this little dog. She doesn't know what to do with it. But yes, it turns out to be an absolute changing point for Rue, because here is somebody that Rue can engage with and can love, which is not true of other human beings at that point in Rue's life.
yeah, yeah. Um, and of course, we never really find out what happened to her. And I suppose in that sense, it's very different from the historical books that you've written. Um, that you know, you are, as you say, immersing yourself in a past world that existed. Here, you've had to create a world from scratch. How was that for you as a writer?
I would say I created nothing from scratch, and I don't know if anyone can. But one of the things I found myself thinking about is Margaret Atwood said about The Handmaid's Tale, there is nothing in this book that has not happened, that has not been done to women somewhere, sometime in the history of the human race. And
Yes.
I would say, on a smaller level, there is nothing in Lost People that hasn't happened. I don't think I could have invented it. I have pulled together, that bit I read just now about the city gradually becoming green again. I watched David Attenborough going into Chernobyl
Yes.
30 years later. I would say, I didn't think I'm just going to copy that, but as I was writing it, the images coming to my mind were from things like that. Um, I couldn't say exactly where everything came from, but when Eleanor speaks about, I lived in the most beautiful city in the world, and talks about the squares and the fountains and the streets and so on. A friend of mine, no longer with us, his favorite city in the world was Aleppo, and he used to talk with great nostalgia about Aleppo. I was almost quoting what I remembered him saying,
Uh-huh.
when I described how she felt about her city that is no longer there. So, unfortunately, the material was to hand. I mean,
Yes.
all these things are there. And I think this is what was seething around in my mind, that all these images are coming at me. I kind of needed to do something with them. So
Hmm.
I would say, yes, I've imagined a post-war world, but there's nothing in it that hasn't already happened.
No, no.
I've also been very careful not to be specific. You don't know who these people are, where they come from, where exactly are we? I've evaded that. And in fact, there are different things that you can't, I hope, pin it down in any way, because I wanted to get outside whose side is anybody on, who's right, who's wrong, who's attacking whom. Beyond all these questions, there are people who just want to live their lives and who are surviving if they can. And it doesn't matter which people. In this context, this is what happens to people under those circumstances. That was what I was after.
Yes, and you've been quite specific about that in that um she when they're talking about Ruth, she is clearly mixed race, but her mother was white, and the mixed
But
race is the norm
yeah,
in that society.
but we never know if the woman who left her there was her mother in the end.
No, no.
So it kind of, if every time, I hope that every time the intention was that you appear to have got hold of something you can call identity, it slithers away, is the idea that
Hmm.
you can't say Rue is X, Y, or Z. I mean,
Yes.
Rue
Yeah.
is a child caught up in this situation.
Yes. And as the one thing is though that most of the references are to Western civilization, aren't they? The dog is called Cosette after the character from Les Miserables. Um, Rue is in Ophelia's speech in Hamlet. You know, all these things are kind of
Yeah.
hinting at this civilization that has been lost.
Yes, and when I say I was trying to evade being specific, it is obviously well, it's definitely Western, so is its author. I suppose I'm drawing on the images that I know, and I think I mean, it's quite Eurocentric. I realise that. I
Mm.
don't think
Well, apart from the golden dragon's not very European, is it?
no, and there are images from here and there, but also, who are the nunks? I'm drawing on places I've been and what I have known,
Hmm.
as to create this mysterious community, though you never quite know what they're all about, I hope.
Yes, yeah, because even the name you don't know what it's about because it's similar to nuns, but they're not nuns, or
Not
maybe they are.
Those are
Maybe
not
they are.
fun. No, they're not.
No, this has been published by this Iona Press, and obviously there is a spiritual journey going on in it. Do you think that is what appealed to them about it?
I think when I looked at their list and approached them, I was very taken with their list on social justice and peace and issues that, well, that speak to me. And I thought, I'll give it a whirl. I think I would fit this list, but not. I mean, you don't have to be of a specific religion. You don't have to be Christian to be published by Iona Books. But when you look at some of the list, I mean, that is where they come from. It's a Christian community, and but Iona Books also has a very strong, as the work they do is to do with what I would regard as secular issues. So yeah, I went with them because they wanted the book and they wanted it very quickly. And I also felt they were aware of what I was trying to do with it, and I think would mark it with that in mind, that it's not an adventure story. It's trying to show a condition and the condition of life. And I thought they get it. And
Yes.
nobody asked me how religious I am or anything like that. They get what the book is about. And yes, these monks, you're meant to question that. What kind of community is that? When Rue goes into the place where the monks do their practice, Rue describes a completely empty building, uh, and speaks about its emptiness and its bareness. And then the music starts to fill it. And there's a lot. I mean, music is a major theme in the book.
Hmm. Hmm. I think that the sort of natural imagery in the book is also very, very powerful, and a kind of antidote to this war that we know has happened.
Mm.
Um, and it's like a reclaiming of what life should be like. The natural world is that's what Rue is engaging with, particularly at first.
I would say, I hope. I mean, one of the things I thought when I was writing it, I mean, I mentioned earlier talking about children and thinking that for people of my generation to just go on saying it's a situation of total despair, we're all finished, we're doomed, it's dreadful. Well, that is not a great message to give to younger people. I think not that I'm addressing younger people with a message, I'd hate to say that, but I think there has to be hope regeneration somewhere. Very hard to see it in the human world, and we are destroying all the other living beings on this planet just as fast as we can. But if we don't succeed in doing that, they will come back. And I think we are so totally out of balance and disconnected with all the other living things that inhabit this planet with us, without whom we can't exist, um, that the balance needs to be redressed. I cannot say that I think it would be redressed very simply and easily. And in fact, one of the bits of research that definitely influenced the world I describe was reading about the aftermath of the Black Death. So, it's not fun, but you end up with a world with far fewer people in it, but there is regeneration. But I described in that piece the empty fields. I did see that traveling, doing work in Bulgaria in early 90s when the collective farms had kind of collapsed, seeing fields that were just not being looked after, and
Uh-huh.
that's an agriculture that in places appeared to have collapsed. And I was describing that. That's where I got that image from.
Oh, I see.
Um, of course, it had to change completely, but something came out of it. So I think we're talking about a world where people have kind of lost hold a lot of the time. And yeah, like the empty city and so on.
Mhm. Interesting what you said about the after the Black Death. In what way was that reflected in the book?
Because after the Black Death, it was I mean, obviously, it was appalling. It was dreadful and unimaginable. There were far fewer people afterwards. There were villages in Europe that disappeared, as a lot of villages all over Europe and probably elsewhere, that just aren't there anymore. You have far smaller population, but actually, for individuals who survived, having been utterly traumatized and lost people and had gone through what happened, if you survived, you could take your place in a different kind of world. There was an interesting program researching people who'd survived the Black Death. And I remember in particular one woman in Essex who lost her father, her brother, her son, everybody. And she appears in the records much later as owning all their farms, being a woman of considerable property and obviously a good businesswoman. Nobody would want to live through the Black Death, but that's how she ended her life.
Yes.
What conclusions you will. And I think the people in Lost People are looking for new ways to be, finding opportunities, but what is anybody like when they've lived through a cataclysm?
Yeah. What I thought was funny was that, when she leaves, she's told, "Oh, you've got these skills." And then she says, "Well, you didn't really know what the world was like out there because nobody wanted her gardening skills or her flute playing skills. They just wanted her to help with the lambing or whatever. So
Yeah,
people
I think
do
the
different."
conductor is out of touch because the conductor has been living in this mysterious community and whatever it's about, but clearly doesn't know what it's like surviving on the road.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And you have two dogs in the book. One of them is called after um, the poor child in Bleak House. Um, why was it important to have two dogs?
Well, dogs' lives are shorter than people's. Um,
Uh-huh.
Rue attracts dogs, and Rue's naming of the dogs was to me significant because Rue does go to school with the orphans, And I find Rue's reading of these classics that they do at school quite interesting, because if you remember, Rue says that the book that poor Joe comes in, Rue doesn't really remember about the other characters or what happened to them. The
Yeah,
image that stays is Joe.
it's
And
true. Yeah,
Bleak House and all the rest is a blur. But who would absolutely focus on the crossing sweeper, this child who is utterly rejected and let down by society,
yeah,
another child who sees something in that. And the
yeah.
same with Cosette. I mean, the waif, the reject, the, you know,
Yeah,
so
she goes to a family that don't want her and all that.
yeah.
Yeah,
So Rue
yeah,
names dogs after these two characters as the ones who stayed in mind after all the and the rest of the book is kind of not relevant to Rue.
Well, I'm going to throw open to the people here if they'd like to ask Margaret any questions. We promised for a question and answer session.
Yes,
Would
I do. Um,
yes.
I was very struck when you were reading, because I realized this was post some kind of almost apocalyptic event, some kind of war. And presumably, although perhaps it's not made clear, it's in the present, rather than the past. And references to things like midwinter and cold. I thought, hang on, surely that's not going to be the case. There's not going to be midwinter and cold very soon, even hardly is now sometimes.
Yeah. I suppose we don't know exactly how climate change is going to impact, and it depends. I don't know. I mean, if this is in a near future, I would think there might still be winters that are quite cold. It doesn't snow.
Ah, perhaps I put that in my imagination.
Um, I think we're having a very cold spring at the moment. I think a very um, unstable climate may produce all sorts of things, and there are all sorts of predictions about exactly how warming will pan out. You may also have spotted, because you're obviously very observant, that the plants are quite varied about where
Yes, I
they.
thought that. I did think that
Yes.
too. Yes.
And again, I am in a way sort of hedging, saying exactly where we are and which part of the world we might exactly be in. So this was all part of it, to bring in different things that might make it different.
Ah,
But that probably doesn't fully answer your question, because I'd left global warming sort of at that stage, but I really don't know what's going to happen.
thank you.
Any more questions?
Can I ask, Margaret, what is your hope for the book? What was you said you had to say something, but what is your hope and your message?
I would hope that it might leave people a bit destabilized about just carrying on in the direction we're going. I mean, it's fiction, not a sort of manifesto about what should happen or how people should behave. But I think all these reflections of possible worlds mirroring the one in which we find ourselves are offering questions in scenarios. This is the way we're heading. Is it a good idea? Do we want this to happen? But at the same time, I felt really strongly that there is so much despair all around us, and so much dystopia, and so many reflections saying there is absolutely no hope. And looking at some older sort of futuristic writing, I wouldn't call it science fiction because there's no science in there really. The older ones tend to suggest that even if there is not hope on a plot level, there is still a spark of human spirit. And I
Mm.
was reading E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops the other day, which was written in 1909, and he knew that we were all going to end up in little cells sitting in front of machines. How did he know that in 1909? Anyway, a lot of these things are very prescient. And one of the things that strikes me about many of them is there's just a little spark of possibility. Even as the protagonist drops dead, they are thinking it doesn't have to be like this, which I would say is the faintest spark of hope.
Yeah.
I can't remember what your question was, and I don't know if I've answered it.
Yeah, kind of. It was. I mean, I suppose I was wondering if you had like a target audience in mind. You know, are you talking to a politician here? Are you speaking to leaders, or, you know, because it's someone mentioned recently that to do with this new law that they've passed here in Scotland about the hate speech and all that. You know, so there was echoes of 1984 was quoted. You know, and
Yeah.
but that, you know. So I was just kind of wondering if you had, you know, not quite a target audience in mind, but is there someone in particular you're speaking to? You know?
Not in particular, no. I mean, I would like to think all these people were going to avidly read it, but
Take it to heart.
not be the case. I would hope it drew attention to what it's like just living through something. There's a bit in Dr. Zhivago where somebody says to Zhivago, "So what did you ever do for the revolution?" And you just haven't engaged and so on. And I think I'm quoting right, but he says something like, "I have survived it. I'm still here. I'm still being a human being and I've got through it. And what's the point of having one if people like me don't survive it?" And I think there's something about that, that wherever in the world we are, there are people, just ordinary people, who have to survive what is thrown at them or not survive. And if they get through it, then there is still a world. I think that would be more like what I was trying to say.
Okay, sure.
Mm.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to, I'd like to thank Margaret for giving us a very entertaining afternoon. I'd also like to thank Zoe and Roger Wickham for Palmer, rather, for Zoe Wickham and Roger Palmer for allowing us to use their facilities, because mine are bust. And I just urge you all to buy the book. It's called Lost People, published by Wild Goose Publications, and you can get it directly from them. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.